welcome everyone to our Naturalist night tonight. I am Hillary from Newport Bay Conservancy. I am seeing a lot of faces that I don't recognize or names that I don't recognize. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Tonight, I am here with Ayn and Lexi from the Climate Action Campaign, and they're going to be talking to us a little bit about how pollution is harming ecosystems and people here in Orange County, as well as what we can do about that, and what's possible for building electrification policy for Orange County cities, and how we all can get involved. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ayn, and welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. It's so wonderful to see some great new faces here. So Lexi and I are both going to sort of tag team this presentation tonight. And Lexi is going to handle the first part, but I think, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself first and introduce Climate Action Campaign, then I'll hand it off to Lexi and then she'll do her part. So thanks again for having us. We're super excited to be here. The purpose of our presentation tonight is to sort of bring you up to speed on the climate crisis and the impacts that it's having, and then also bring you up to speed on what is possible in terms of solutions and how Newport Bay Conservancy and individuals like yourselves can be part of that solution. So Lexi's going to talk about kind of the environmental injustices and the problems that we're seeing right now, and then I'll talk about the solutions piece and building electrification in particular as a major policy solution that we have available to us and to cities all over Orange County, and how you can be a part of that. So first, a personal introduction. I'm a mom, and I would say that creating safety is probably the defining value of my life. I had a very chaotic upbringing. I spent some time in foster care, so preventing suffering for vulnerable children and for mothers is personally very important to me, and is what brings me to climate action, understanding that vulnerable folks like these are the ones who are and will be most impacted. So we know that climate change will cause political instability and food insecurity and these kinds of effects that we hear about, but I don't think that really conveys the magnitude of what those problems are, words like that. And I always think back about a story that I heard some years ago about a situation in Somalia where there was political instability and a mother who was forced by that instability to march across the desert with her 2 young children. And after a few days, she just couldn't carry them both anymore. And anyone who's a parent knows what it is to try and carry more than one child. And so she had to decide which one to set down and leave behind. And so this is the kind of story that I often reflect on, you know, as far as like guiding action on the climate crisis and what it actually is going to mean to people and already is meaning to people. So we cannot overstate the trouble we're in on the climate crisis. I'm going to introduce you a little bit to Climate Action Campaign and then I'll hand it off to Lexi. So next slide, please. So Climate Action Campaign is a community-driven, community-supported climate nonprofit, 501c3, and we do depend on community donations to do our work. So we appreciate any contribution that you can make. We have a bottom-up strategy that pilots successful local policy solutions that creates models that can be scaled and replicated at the state and the national levels. And we have seen success with that. In particular, one of our early victories in 2015, a clean energy victory in San Diego, has been subsequently replicated by the state of California and Governor Newsom, and also at the national level by President Biden. So we have seen this work, and we believe it is a winning model. So our mission is to stop the climate emergency by championing a zero carbon future. And we organize this work into 5 fights through a lens of equity and justice. And you'll see those here on the screen. Our 5 fights are 100% clean electricity, which is something we've worked on quite a bit in Orange County. Then also all electric homes, which we're going to talk about tonight, bikeable, walkable neighborhoods, world-class transit, and resiliency. So we understand that the technology and the policy changes that we need to achieve a livable future are affordable. They'll actually save us money, and that they will make us healthier, and they are all feasible, and they're available to us today with no additional technology that needs to be developed. All we need is actually the political will to bring them to life and make them happen. And these are available at the local level. So that's the good news. So with that, I will pass it off to my wonderful colleague, Lexi, to share some information with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ayn. So before I talk a little bit about the actual, problem of climate change and who is most impacted and how it is that we are impacted, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Lexi. I am the Orange County Climate Equity Organizer and Advocate with Climate Action Campaign, and a bit about how I sort of came to this work. I grew up not too far away from Orange County in the Inland Empire. And if you know anything about the Inland Empire, you know that we have really bad air quality. And specifically the area that I grew up at first was very rural. We had a lot of dairy farms. And because of that, outside it always smelled really bad. I never really thought too much about that because I was like, well, that's just what California smells like. That's not what California smells like. That's just what my neighborhood smelled like. And everyone I knew growing up also had asthma, also had eczema, would have some sort of respiratory disease, had a lot of health issues. And this was just really normal for us. It was a bit of a joke. We would trade eczema creams at school, depending on who had the better one. And these were all things that I thought was really, really normal, until it is that I moved back to Orange County and realized that this isn't what most people had to grow up with, because most people didn't grow up living in so much pollution. So that is sort of how I came to understand environmental justice within the context of climate change, and why I really am connected to this work and continue to do it, because I don't want other people to have to grow up in that same way that I did. Because as climate change sort of progressive, that becomes more and more of a reality for more people. So to sort of talk about climate change more generally, I'm sure we're all kind of familiar with the idea of climate change, and this is just a little bit of data and background. I am a huge data nerd, so if you have questions about this later on, we can also go over it. I get really excited. I know that is not how most people feel though, but basically what this graph is showing you is that a lot of scientists, all scientists agree that climate is changing. It is getting hotter. And a lot of the reason why it is changing is because of things that we are doing. It is human caused. And you can see that as we have more greenhouse gases, we also are seeing an increase in temperature. So it is actually burning greenhouse gases, creating greenhouse gases, which comes from burning fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal, which is actually creating this increase in temperature. So I grew up hearing a lot about carbon dioxide. Whenever we would talk about climate change, I would hear about carbon dioxide, and we would just say, this is what we need to limit. This is what's responsible for greenhouse gases. This is what's responsible for this warming effect. And while that's true, it is also true that methane in the short span has way more of an impact than carbon dioxide does. And methane is something that we don't talk about as often, even though it is actually 80 times more potent or has 80 times a stronger warming effect than carbon dioxide does. So I know you might hear that. The first time that I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, it's even worse than I thought. I don't know what we're going to do now. But this is actually, in a way, great news. I know that sounds really weird to hear, but it's great because methane is actually a really short-lived gas, meaning that if we stop our production of methane right now, it will have really big impacts on the total amount of greenhouse gases that we have in the climate, and also, progression of climate change in general. So you might be thinking, okay, where does methane come from? I know where carbon dioxide comes from. We hear a whole bunch about that. Well, it also comes from burning fossil fuels, but methane is in a lot of places that we are really constantly. Methane is in our homes. Methane is in the buildings that we live in and we work in. And also methane leaks all the time, being piped to and from those places where we're using it. So there's really methane all around us. Once again, you might hear all that and be like, oh my gosh, this is so much. This is like just so much going on. How are we going to do anything about this? Or even if, that climate doomism might sort of sneak in, you might be feeling like we can't do anything. this graph, more data gives me so much hope. We really can start to make a difference and actually get the reductions we need to not have these climate impacts. So this shows you a couple of different scenarios of what would happen when we start cutting our greenhouse gas emissions. So if we were to start cutting our greenhouse gas emissions right now, and we had a 50% cut, we would have 10 years to actually reduce all of our emissions. Now, if we had started in 2000, we would have had 30 years to reduce our emissions. But if we keep waiting until later on to reduce our emissions, then we're only going to have a few months to completely reduce our emissions all the way down. So the sooner we start, the better. I've heard before the best time to start acting on climate change was yesterday, and the second best time is today. So that really does, I hope, give everyone a bit of hope that we can start doing this right now. Oh, one slide too far. So when we think about climate change and who is impacted, I think it's easy to just think about sort of the world as a whole, but it is helpful, I think, in this way to sort of break up who is actually being impacted. So we obviously think a lot about the environment, the physical environment around us. We can physically see that some plants will no longer grow. We can see that we have less trees. We can see some of these environmental impacts around us. Even if you're spending enough time outdoors, sometimes we can also get to see the way that it impacts plants and animals. So as we do have changing climates, we will have disruptions in food chains and food webs in the ecosystems, less of animals that we usually see, less biodiversity. And these are things that we are physically going to see happening around us. Something that we don't get to actually see as often, though, is the human impact of this. And that's because it's what's happening day to day to the people that maybe, only live about 5 minutes away from us or us. But a lot of times because we don't connect what is happening to climate change. So like I said, growing up, I had eczema, asthma, everyone had a lot of these health issues. None of us connected this to climate change and to methane emission, which is, furthering climate change. We just thought that's just how it is where we live. But it is a climate change issue. So when we actually get to thinking about humans and how we are being impacted, this shows a little bit about, in our community, who is actually feeling these impacts of climate change. So when we think about it, these two sort of graphs here show the CalEnviro screening. And basically, this is a tool that anybody can use. You can just Google the CalEnviro screen 4.0, and this will come up. And you can search in the search bar any city in California, and it will show you this information and data. So I just searched Newport so we can get an idea. And this will show you all the pollution in your area. It's primarily focused on air pollution, but it does have sort of scores for different types of pollution as well, such as if you have toxic waste, water pollution, things like that. But if we look here in Newport, we can see most of it is green, meaning we have a really great healthy environment. But if you look sort of right there, sort of lining the freeway, we do have communities that are in that more orange territory. And if you look over here to the left-hand side, they actually are in the 82nd percentile. That's their overall score. So what that means is that they are experiencing more of a pollution burden than 82% of all other communities in California. So they have a lot of pollution in their neighborhood, and maybe you live there, or maybe you know someone who lives there, because this is so close to Newport and also Newport Bay. But then if we look at, what sort of pollution are we experiencing there, you can see in that second hand list down here where it says exposures, what actually is making up that pollution. So some of it is ozone, some of it is particulate matter, which would come from like cars, diesel matter, again, coming from cars, toxic release. This comes from industry, traffic, pesticides, 0, that's great. Drinking water, 6, lead from housing. So it'll show you where actually that pollution is coming from. And then if we look over here, kind of again, getting an understanding of how some folks are more impacted than others, we see that in this area, it's actually 76% Hispanic. So I did a little bit of just looking around the demographics of Newport and around this sort of existing area. And this is one of the most diverse areas sort of near Newport. And it's also one of the most polluted areas. So we start to see that connection between pollution and people who historically have sort of experienced injustice and oppression. And also it shows you sort of down here at the very bottom that the people living in this community specifically also have linguistic isolation, which means lots of folks who don't necessarily speak English, a really high percentile of poverty, a good amount of unemployment, and then housing burden, which means multiple people living in one home. And why I say that those who contribute the least will suffer the most is because usually people who are of lower socioeconomic standing do have a lower actual greenhouse gas footprint than other folks do a lot of the time because they just have less access. So they have more sustainable practices like taking the bus, buying less things because it's just what makes the most sense for them. Yet they still live in the communities where they experience the most amount of pollution in their everyday lives. And then if we even want to zoom out to sort of Orange County as a whole and think about a lot of our other neighbors who maybe we're seeing on the weekend, right, at the beach, in a lot of areas, it doesn't look as green as it does in Newport. We see it's really this deep red color. And in this one specific area in Santa Ana where it is, I believe it was in the 93rd percentile for pollution burden. So literally about a 20-minute drive from us, there are people who are experiencing more pollution than 93% of all other communities in California. It's also 91% Hispanic. So again, we see that sort of connection between communities of concern and areas where there are pollution. So this sort of brings me to the question of what is environmental justice? So environmental justice sort of begins to deal with this pattern that we're seeing of folks who have historically experienced oppression and where pollution is located in our communities and in our city. So the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, and income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, which is a very long way of saying that all people deserve to live in clean environments, to work in clean environments, to have clean water, clean air, and really have just a safe way of living and a safe future. And that's not necessarily true when we look back at those maps and see how much pollution there are in communities, and specifically in communities where it is predominantly it is more diverse areas, or it is areas where people are experiencing poverty, or it is areas where there already is just more oppression that comes along with some of those identities. And this is a pattern that isn't just something that we're seeing in Orange County. This is something that we're seeing all over. And just to give a couple of examples, when it comes to air pollution, this was a study that was conducted in 2012 and then updated in 2019, which found that Black and Latinx communities experience 60% more air pollution than they cause. So again, they're not necessarily creating this air pollution, but they still live in areas where we're experiencing this air pollution. And some of this pollution comes from the oil and gas, which is being burned in these communities, but being extracted in communities like ours, like literally right off the coast where we have oil rigs. So we, are still a part of this process where we're seeing it occur. The same thing is true of toxic waste sites. So in the 80s, there was basically the first ever study that was seeing what is the connection between race and toxic waste. And they found that race was the #1 predictor of where toxic waste sites were located throughout the entire US. They actually did sort of a follow-up study to that in the early 2000s. And they're like, okay, it's been 20 years. We have known that this has been occurring. There must have been some progress. I'm sure it's better by now. And they found that race was still the #1 indicator of where toxic waste sites were located. So even though we're aware of this pattern, it's something, because of just the way that we've already organized our cities, it's very hard to change. But the more we become aware of it and intentional about it and sort of talk about environmental justice, the better we become at actually being able to change this for people. So this is just a little bit of a graphic that shows a couple of the different ways that people are really impacted by pollution in their daily lives. And again, this comes back to the human aspect that we don't always see, right? So we don't get to see inside of everybody else's homes. and we don't see that maybe they have more nitrogen dioxide, or that they live next to a freeway, or what the water that comes out of their sink looks like. We just get to see them when they leave their home. But this is actually what a lot of folks are dealing with, especially when they are people of color or people who just haven't had as much privilege, and maybe don't have the same resources as others. So that is sort of why environmental justice is a really big piece, because when it comes to solving climate change, if we want to solve it for anybody, it means that we have to solve environmental injustice for everyone, because there are some people who sort of disproportionately are bearing the burden of climate change right now. And as the issue sort of continues to worsen, it'll just keep getting worse until eventually all of us are impacted. But if we want to address climate change, we have to do it for everyone in a very equitable way. And Ayn will sort of take us through some of the policies that we can actually use to start to address it. And I know that hearing all that definitely feels like a lot. I remember when and even still now, I hear about it and it just feels very heavy, and like, there's so much going on. These are patterns all over the US. What are we going to do? But there is a lot that we can do right here as individuals and in our own city. And Ayn is great always at bringing back that inspiration to me. So I know that she'll do the same for you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lexi. Yes. So as Lexi said, we are in a big hot mess and people are suffering now. And it's not fair, and it's a terrible situation. It's only going to get worse. But the good news is that we can do something about this. So I want you to take away these three things at minimum from our presentation today. One is that actually greenhouse gases are, of course, what causes climate change. I think Lexi covered that. So greenhouse gases meaning carbon dioxide, methane, and others. But so that's what's causing it. But fortunately, cities are what causes the majority of greenhouse gases. According to the United Nations, upwards of 2/3 of emissions are caused by cities. And I'm guessing that probably almost everyone on this call lives in either a city or a county, some sort of jurisdiction. And so the good news is that you can definitely change your city. And I have seen this happen. A small group of people working together, just like Margaret Mead said, it's the only thing that ever has changed the world, is a small group of people working together. Because the truth is that in most cases, there's no one showing up at your city asking about climate change, and there's nobody talking about methane and the actions that are very much within the reach of your city. There are major policy tools that are available to your city that you can get adopted if you decide to do that. So I'm going to move ahead. I wanted to put one slide in here on kind of how we got here, and Lexi covered some of that. But also, we have to, a lot of times when we think about climate change, the climate crisis, we get overwhelmed, and then we fall into a trap of thinking that was deliberately created for us, and it's called the carbon footprint. And I wanted to just tee up for everyone and be clear that this was actually invented by the fossil fuel industry. The idea of the carbon footprint calculator, literally invented by BP, British Petroleum, a fossil fuel company, in 2004. And they did this in order to distract from anyone from focusing on what they were doing by making money and having an entire industry built on destroying our earth and destroying people's lives, basically. And so they don't want you to think about that. Don't look over here, look over here at what you're doing. And how about that bottle in your hand? And so this is like victim blaming on a monstrous scale. It was a very successful marketing campaign that persists in its success today. But we need to stop thinking of it this way. We need to go for the big low-hanging fruit that's available to us in terms of policy solutions. And so we need to focus our minds and understand that all we need is political will to bring these solutions to life. And so please reject that carbon footprint thinking. Okay, so let's talk about solutions. What can be done? Let's talk about where emissions are coming from, in particular in Orange County cities. This is a greenhouse gas inventory provided by the city of Irvine in their 2020 Strategic Energy Plan, which they are in the process of updating now. But this is the latest information that we have, or they said that actually 56% of emissions in Irvine, on this large outer ring that you see here, are from facilities, and that means buildings. And so what do we mean by that? That includes the energy that is used for when you turn on lights in a building, and when you heat water in a building, and turn on a furnace in a building. Any of those things are what's driving emissions. And so again, the good news is that that's something that we can fix. So next slide. So what do we do? What is available to us? We think a big part of the solution has to be a campaign that we are calling #ElectrifyOC. So what do we mean by that? We mean that, once you're in a hole, you need to stop digging a hole, right? This is just some folk wisdom that I think applies here. We need to stop creating the emissions that are driving climate change. And that means we need no more gas-powered machines. We need no more gas-powered machines for driving, for water heating, for space heating, for cooking, for clothes drying, for any of these things that we do. Why do we need to do that? As Lexi mentioned, methane gas in buildings is a potent fossil fuel. It is driving the climate crisis. It is harming our health. And also in terms of the benefit of stopping, in terms of climate, science says what we need to do in order to be climate safe is we need to reach zero carbon by 2030, and we need to reach negative emissions after that. Like Lexi mentioned, there's been a tremendous amount of delay. The IPCC report said in 2018 that we had 12 years to work with, but then we really didn't do anything after that for a lot of reasons. So now, math and physics being what they are, we have 8 years. And so it is still possible to reduce emissions in line with a livable future, but we're going to have to do it through really rapid electrification. We can do it using already well-developed technologies, and that means wind and solar power plants. It means rooftop solar, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and batteries. None of this is particularly mysterious. It's all well-proven technology. So the good news is that if we do this, go back one more, I'm not quite done. If we can get everyone to do this, to use carbon-free energy to heat their homes and to get around, the bulk of the problem will be solved. But because buildings have a 50 to 100 year lifespan, we cannot afford to be building any more gas buildings at this time ever again, period. And so we need the policies that are going to expedite that transition from these methane gas burning appliances and buildings to all electric. And that's what's going to keep us safe. It's going to improve our health and save us money and create millions of jobs and a huge boost to our economy. So next slide, please. So this is what we mean by the all electric home. It's illustrated here. You can see on the left, the clean all electric house, on the right, your current gas burning house, and all the benefits associated with each. The clean all electric house will give us local clean energy jobs, will provide health and safety benefits, save us money and energy, bring cleaner air and renewable energy. Whereas a gas burning house is of course powered by gas, provides health and safety risks, including explosions, which no one enjoys, and then just day-to-day air quality issues, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. It's very wasteful, actually. It turns out that burning a fossil fuel is a terrible way to create energy. And then it's powered by a very leaky methane network that actually there's just as much, at least as much methane used at the end of the line, at your stove and at your water heater, just as much that leaks out along those leaky pipelines all the way along. So yes, it's a very inefficient and problematic network, and then it causes indoor and outdoor air pollution. Next slide. So unfortunately, we are headed in the wrong direction. California is actually adding more new gas customers faster than any other state. And so this is very disturbing, and again, shows a trend going in absolutely the wrong direction. But city policy is the answer to this problem. So next slide, please. I wanted to show you a little bit. I saw some questions in the chat just about where emissions come from. And in terms of the home, I thought this would be interesting to look at residential gas, methane gas consumption by end use, by appliance. So you can see that the biggest user in house or any building is the water heater, usually a gas water heater. And then we have just after that, a space heater, a gas furnace in most cases. And so these are definitely way at the top in terms of usage, right? With 49% and 37%. The stove at 7% is lower in terms of gas use, but is the biggest culprit in terms of indoor air pollution because it's located, directly in the middle of, probably the most commonly used living space in the house. And some research has shown that which I'm going to show you in a minute, it leaks constantly and all the time, whether you're using it or not. So this is where those emissions come from. But fortunately, there's an electric alternative for all of these devices. And so, of course, a good thing about these devices is they all fail eventually and they need to be replaced. And so we need to replace them all like as soon as possible, but it doesn't mean you have to go out and replace it today. It just means that when this appliance is due for a replacement, the replacement has to be electric, and we need the policies that are going to support that. So next slide. There are also a number of benefits that come along with building electrification that I've already mentioned. One is that it brings housing and energy cost benefits, tremendous savings, health and air quality, high quality job opportunities, and of course, clean and reliable energy. And I'll go into more about those in particular right now. So in terms of public health, there's actually higher pollution levels coming from the stove in your house than from the highways and ports that you live next to, and that's even if you live in a highly polluted area or anywhere else. So and these pollution levels would actually be illegal if they occurred outside your home, but EPA rules do not apply to indoor air, unfortunately. And so this is just something that we're all exposed to all the time. So Stanford University recently came out with some very compelling research illustrating these effects. And so we wanted to share it with you. So Lexi, if you could play that, thank you.
From natural gas appliances is one of the low-hanging fruits that we have to reducing these emissions of methane gas. In the United States, there are over 40 million natural gas stoves. Natural gas is composed of mostly methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. In this research, we were trying to answer the question, how much methane do natural gas stoves emit, either while they're off or while they're on and while they're turning on and off? We found that methane emissions from natural gas stoves are equivalent to about the carbon dioxide emissions from 500,000 cars over a 20-year lifespan.
We found a couple of interesting things. The first was that most of the natural gas we found leaking into the air from stoves wasn't while the stove was in operation, but just simply leaking while it was off from fittings and leaky pipes and things like that. So that was the first surprise. And the second was that the amount of methane leaking out of stoves was higher than we expected and higher than estimated by the Environmental Protection Agency.
Simultaneously, we were also measuring the amount of nitrogen oxides, NOx, that were emitted during combustion of the stove. Given the rates of NOx emissions from stoves, we found that the exposure threshold of 100 parts per billion can quickly be exceeded in the matter of minutes just by using your burners and ovens. The mere existence of these gas stoves are really driving the emissions. So it's not how much they're used, but it's the number of them and the leakiness of the stove while it's off.
Methane leakage from stoves could be eliminated, but we can't eliminate the carbon dioxide emissions from burning natural gas. So at some point, and at some point quickly, we need to replace all of our natural gas appliances for cleaner electric appliances. And there are a lot of good reasons for doing that. Climate change is one, but human health and air quality is another.
Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, one interesting thing that I learned as I was, researching this and on the SoCalGas website, actually, I'm not sure if you've ever checked, but according to SoCalGas, if you have a gas stove, they indicate that you're supposed to have your stove serviced every year to make sure that it's not leaking. I don't know if anyone on this call has ever had a gas stove serviced. I just recently got an induction cooktop, which I love. But I had one my whole life and had never had one, had never heard about that. So I thought that was interesting. And these impacts that we hear about and that were demonstrated in this research, the greatest impacts are actually on the most vulnerable populations, again, because the smaller the space, the more concentrated the air pollution. And the more people in a home, and especially in a smaller home, the greater the exposure. And so there is a tremendous public health benefit to be had here. I think, yeah, you can go on to the next slide, please, Lexi. So infants, vulnerable populations are, the most at risk here. Infants and children are more susceptible to the illnesses associated with air pollution than adults, and that's due to several factors that are sort of intuitive to understand. They breathe faster, they tend to engage in more physical activity, they spend more time outdoors, they have a higher ratio of lung surface to body weight, and they have a less mature respiratory and immune system. And that's why children who live in a home with a gas stove have a 42% increased risk of asthma, as you can see on screen here. Other folks that are at particular risk from these stoves are pregnant women, because these sorts of pollutants from gas stoves have been linked to an increased risk of adverse birth outcomes, including both for the mother's health and the baby's growth and development. And that includes preeclampsia and preterm birth and low birth weight, among others. Also, individuals with pre-existing conditions are particularly at risk because exposure to air pollution can be really damaging to organs that are already fighting disease. So that means asthma, it means obstructive pulmonary disease or heart or lung disease and diabetes. And as a result of that, people with these pre-existing health conditions may actually get worse symptoms and have an increased need for medication. They'll need more frequent emergency room visits and can even experience premature death as a result of that air pollution. And then also, finally, older adults and the elderly, because these adults experience changes in their lung function and in their heart function as they age. And so that makes them particularly vulnerable, and long-term exposure to these air pollutants, even at relatively low levels, increases their risk of developing respiratory and cardiovascular conditions. And that includes pneumonia and heart attack and stroke. And it's also been linked to neurocognitive decline, and that includes dementia and increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So even if you don't care about climate, there's lots of good reasons to take a closer look at that gas stove in your home. Next slide. There is also an incredible opportunity for California's economy. A wealth of research has shown that a statewide transition to all electric buildings is actually going to require the talents and skills of workers from all over the economy. And a recent study found that electrifying all of California's existing and new buildings by 2045, which is not soon enough, but by 2045 would increase or would create over 100,000 full-time jobs in various sectors of the economy. And that represents a net increase in jobs even after you account for losses in the fossil fuel industry. So this is, again, a huge opportunity. And the great thing about these jobs is that they are jobs in our garages, replacing these gas water heaters, and in our attics, replacing our furnaces. These are jobs that cannot be outsourced. These are going to be local jobs. So it is a tremendous opportunity. And next slide. In terms of savings, households in California stand to save a lot of money from electrification. By electrifying all energy in the typical California household, we can see the potential for large annual savings that could be realized as soon as 2025 if we get started today. And under this, the sort of best case scenario, California would save more than $320 billion in household savings that would flow into the larger economy. And as a monthly savings, we would see a $2,500 savings, over $2,500 dollar savings, as we see here. And anyone who is driving a gas-powered car currently can probably attest to that and the savings that you can experience through clean electricity. Some more good news is that electricity is getting cleaner. And this reflects a win that we had earlier this year through the Orange County Power Authority and Community Choice Energy, when 3 Orange County cities voted to make 100% renewable electricity their default. And so we're going to have a lot more clean electricity. And even for cities who aren't in a community choice energy program, just through California's minimum renewable portfolio standards that all investor-owned utilities are subject to, the minimum renewables for just a regular Edison customer is 38.5% starting this year, 38.5% renewable. And so that's a lot more than 100% fossil fuel based, which is what your methane fuel source is. So that is really, it's a really exciting opportunity. And I would just say about this, this headline that we see here, this is from an LA Times story. This just underscores the point that we can win these local fights. And that's why the city council meeting is your venue of choice for your climate, salvation, if that's what you want. So a word about adoption rates, and this is a pretty wonky slide, and I have another one just like it, just after it, but this shows what it's going to take to keep us in a livable range based on adoption rates of technology and the various climate outcomes that we could see. So what the IPCC recommends is this 1.5 degrees Celsius yellow band that we see sticking up here. And then where we get into real trouble is where we get over to this like 2 degrees or 3+ degrees Celsius. And so if you go to the next slide, it'll show how these can be achieved. So if we had a magic wand, then we could take this straight shot up with this light green line all the way over at the left and go to 100% adoption today. I do not have a magic wand. If I did, I assure you I would use it. But if we don't have that, then the next best thing is this early retirement of the appliance, of the machine, then 100%. If we wait till we get 100% replacement end of life, you can see what is possible. And then if, on down the line, and with the worst case scenario being the invisible hand free market option, where we just wait for everybody to do whatever they want, and that we can see is not consistent with livable outcomes. So unfortunately, there's no way to accomplish the sort of rapid energy transition that we need with market-based policies. A 100% adoption rate is only achieved by mandate. And like I said, this invisible hand is definitely not fast enough. It typically takes decades for a new technology to become dominant. And by market forces alone, that is, as it slowly increases its market share year after year. And market subsidies are not enough. And unfortunately, a carbon tax isn't fast enough either on its own. So businesses and the market can help, but as they say, I love the saying from Saul Griffith, who built these slides, that when Mother Nature arm wrestles with the invisible hand, she always wins. So you can put your money on Mother Nature every single time. So this is why we need policy change. We need to facilitate that, at least the early retirement, then 100% option. And again, this is something that your city council can do. So how do we do that locally? Well, we do that with a REACH code. And 54, I think at this point, California cities have adopted building gas bans and electrification REACH code. What is a REACH code? A REACH code is a local building energy code that reaches beyond the state minimum requirements for energy use in building design and in construction. And that creates opportunities for local governments to lead the way on these sorts of clean air initiatives, on climate solutions, and create roadmaps for other local governments to take as well. So you can see here that these kinds of policies have been adopted all up and down the state, as far north as Humboldt, or Healdsburg, I guess this is, and as far south as, I don't know what the furthest south one is there. But if you see here in the middle, Orange County, go to Orange County and go to the next slide, and I have a zoom in on that. You can see what's happening in Orange County, and it's a whole lot of nothing. We have a lot that's happened in LA, and we have a lot that's happened and is continuing to happen in San Diego. But no Orange County city has yet adopted a building electrification policy. Irvine has started on that path, and we were excited in December when the council voted to direct staff to conduct stakeholder outreach and start drafting an ordinance. But unfortunately, we've heard rumors and we are seeing signs that Irvine may be backing away from building electrification. We hope it's not true, but we need to keep pushing cities for these solutions. So finally, I think this is my last slide here. Oh yes, I'm going to revisit this because I want y'all to remember it. Of course, GHGs cause climate change. Cities cause GHGs. You can change your city. So we have a handy to-do list for you next. And we want to invite you all to join the Orange County Climate Coalition. We created the Climate Coalition as a place where organizations and individuals can come together to take action and to build the will that we're going to need to make these changes. I would say actually as an organization, the Newport Bay Conservancy, which I think you all have an affiliation with, has a lot of power and a reputation that could be a big part of the solution if you choose to use it. So we would love to collaborate with NBC and with you as individuals if you are interested in being part of, the solution on this and saving Newport Bay and everything else in the world that we love. So for individuals, our Orange County Climate Coalition is a place to learn how to engage in your city. Our next meeting on April 24th is going to unpack the mysteries of your city council meeting and help you learn how to engage there and how to understand the agenda and what's happening and be effective in that space. So in conclusion, I want to sort of offer you some chicken soup for the soul and tell you to please not worry about what you cannot control. Do not worry about the UN Climate Conference or about NATO or about Build Back Better. And you can stop obsessing about your plastic bag purchases, although you want to go ahead and switch to wax paper or reusable containers. But what we want to worry about is the big stuff. We want to keep an unflinching focus on big decisions, on city policy that we can really impact. So we want to go to our city council website and, to our council meeting, ask them what they're doing about climate change. And that really makes them nervous, I have to say. And you will get their attention if you start to ask about these things. So that's it. So I hope that you will all, if you have anything that keeps you up at night or worries you about climate, know that you do have power to impact this. We're in Orange County, which is the 6th most populous county in the United States. And a lot of people at the national level watch Orange County to see how things will play out and what is possible in terms of policy. And so what happens in Orange County is very important and super relevant. So I invite you to all bring whatever it is you love, bring all your systemic advantages and, whatever skills you have, and that is what is going to help drive you through to help solve this problem. So yeah, so your questions, I saw lots of questions in the chat. We welcome them all. So I don't know if, Hillary, do you want to give us them one at a time or however you'd like to handle that?
Sure, yeah, we had quite a few questions come in the chat, starting with during Lexi's presentation. The first one was the main component of biogas is methane. Food waste is converted to biogas. Should this conversion be banned to reduce methane emissions?
Yeah, so definitely methane is a part of sort of this natural cycle of gases, like especially when we think about it coming from our food. But what's not natural is the way that we are burning it for fuel and for electricity. So that is where a way larger sort of percentage of our methane use and also methane emissions come from. When we think about what it will actually mean to electrify everything and start using renewable energy sources, obviously we don't want to have to use biofuels. We want to grow food to eat food and not to have to use it as a fuel. There will be some things that we won't be able to use electricity for, and we will have to rely on biofuels or maybe other types of fuels that are more powerful that aren't fossil fuels. But for the most part, we don't necessarily need biofuels, and we definitely don't need methane in our homes. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your questions. Biofuels are helpful for some things, but definitely not needed for our daily lives when we can switch to renewable energy for most things that most of us normal people need.
Great, thank you. The next question was, doesn't development using construction cause lots of emissions, concrete production emissions, lots of CO2?
It does use, there are emissions used from that. And so we want to use sustainable materials as much as possible. But again, we want to focus on the decisions that are within our control and the factors that are within our control. So when we, I don't know, we don't want to put our focus on something that we can't impact. What is the path to reducing emissions from concrete? There are people that are working on that actually, and certain industrial processes, it will make sense to use certain, like green hydrogen. That is one of the few legitimate uses for it, that and maritime shipping. But yeah, so we definitely, we want to use less concrete, but we still need our cities to adopt, the sorts of climate policies that they are able to do. But we can share, I'll pull a nice graph that shows like where all the emissions come from, which might be interesting for people to look at, for those who are curious.
Yeah, great. There was another question here that I think you touched on a little bit. It was, doesn't electricity production use coal? And I know you've mentioned clean electricity. I don't know if you want to touch on that question directly.
In California, in investor-owned utilities in California are not permitted to use coal for electricity sourcing. So the balance of your electricity is produced from burning of methane. Other than that 38.5% that I said that is renewable by mandate. Starting this year, most of the rest is often, it depends on what time of day you're talking about, but certainly in the peak hours of the evening currently is majority methane, but no, not coal in California. If you were in like Florida or Georgia, you'd be in a different situation, but fortunately in California, we have that going for us.
Great. We had one last question in the chat, which was, how is your organization leveraging the upcoming June election? And is there anything we should look out for?
Well, we are a 501c3, so Climate Action Campaign does not do, electioneering or politicking in particular. There are good organizations that do that. There's like Orange County League of Conservation Voters, or California, I think it's been renamed California Environmental Voters, but the Orange County chapter still has that League of Conservation Voters banner on it. I would say, like between 15 and 20% of people usually vote in their city council election. And so, which is a really unfortunate statistic. And, the younger folks are, the less likely they are to vote in a local election because they don't see the connection between their city council and, issues that they care about. But we tell people all the time, like, you do not have a city council, you have a climate council, because that body is doing climate policy all day long, every day. They're doing land use, and they're doing transportation, and they can do energy if they choose to, and all these things are climate policy. So yeah, because we're a 501c3, unfortunately we can't engage in that, but I would encourage people, if they want to, you know, we know other people who are working on that, and you know, maybe we could put you in touch with them. And like I said, California or Orange County League of Conservation Voters might be a good place to go. League of Women Voters, I think maybe also, I'm not sure. They seem to have been engaged on some of that in the past too. Lexi, were you gonna add anything on that?
No, I think that's good. I think Wave is a great place, as well as League of Conservation Voters for kind of that environmental perspective.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Craig Preston. I'm gonna ask you to allow you to unmute yourself, Craig.
Okay, thank you. Ian and Lexi, thanks for this presentation. I got on late because I was having trouble finding a ticket to how to get here, but thanks for helping me get here. And Ian, thanks for the history of the footprint. It does seem like in the climate space, lots of confusion that serves the status quo. That the fossil fuel interests would love us to be confused, love us to be frustrated, love us to just throw our hands up in the air and like, well, what can we do? So thank you for bringing it local, that attending your city council meeting is something you can do. So love it. I've been to a few, but yeah, it's kind of a new skill to go to. If I'm hearing you right, that the ideal would be to go full electric immediately. Immediately my brain goes, okay, that would be like stopping a car immediately, and that causes problems too. Everything flies and hits the windshield. But I hear you saying, based on the gravity of the problem, getting to full electric as soon as possible is ideal. But in terms of practicality, governments can do regulations, they can do incentives, they can do a price. If we set a price of $1 million per greenhouse gas ton, that would be similar to a regulation. But regulations seem like it's good for poisons. It's good for us to stop things that are immediately killing people. Incentives help move people to go buy stuff and make it a little bit more doable. A price kind of can go across a lot of barriers. I'm afraid that when Australia and France moved on this stuff, there was such a revolt. There was a thing called the Yellow Jackets, and they burned cop cars because they didn't want to see their gasoline prices go up. So I appreciate that there's an education component and just being a good example, that I would think Irvine is leading in Orange County to be a good example. And we're hoping to get the other 34 cities on board with continuing to have a climate action plan and move forward. So can you speak to that, of how do we avert having a harsh reaction where people are just feeling like, you're going to take away my gas stove? What do you say?
Well, I mean, what you want to start with, what we would look to start with for a city would be the REACH code, which is for new construction. So this isn't necessarily changing anyone's life all that much. This would just be for new buildings going in. This is sort of like the easier lift. The truth is that, of course, climate change is going to disrupt everything, right? And so on a scale that like we can't even fathom at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, the solutions that we're going to have to adopt are going to be disruptive also. But I think as people learn more about the risks that come with some of these, you know, technologies that we've just accepted for so long, the gas stove being chief among them, then they will see the path forward. Fortunately, you know, there has been considerable funding dedicated at both the state and federal level now, like billions of dollars. And so cities should begin to, in the coming years, have access to that funding and can put it to work, providing rebates for appliances like these. And then again, as people want to remodel and they need to replace an appliance, that's where we look for a retrofit policy. So that can put in like a zoning requirement that, you know, if someone wants to permit new work, that they would have to go with all electric appliance replacement. But, you know, we have made tremendous changes before. You know, in World War II, our economy turned on a dime to ramp up production of all manner of things that were necessary. And so we can do hard things if we put our minds to it. And so it just is a matter of like how much we care. I mean, everything is at stake, literally. And so I know it can be hard to be optimistic about our ability to actually make these changes when, we look around and see these political realities around us. But yeah, I think we just have to persist. And so many people are living with the consequences of climate change now and are seeing their impacts personally, have had to evacuate, have had to pack a go box. Once you've had that experience, then you kind of look at things a little bit differently, and more people will have those experiences. We had a heat wave last week here in, early spring. So that's what I would say to that. I don't know, Lexi, what you'd like to add.
Yeah, I would just add to, as far as that, maybe like on a more personal individual level, sort of having some of that resistance to actually having those changes in your home. I know we talk a lot about the gas stove because it does have such a big health impact on you. But if we're talking only from a climate perspective, one of the biggest sort of like emitters of methane in your home is your water heater, right? And like that is in like your AC, your air cooler, that's in your garage. You never see that. So if you switch it to electric, that's like no big deal. And also if like with what I was saying about having funding for these, and it does become more equitable, say your water heater, your AC finally goes out, you go to Home Depot to buy a new one and the electric one is cheaper because the city policies is already in place. You're not even going to think twice about it. You're going to be like, oh, cool, this is cheaper, I'm going to buy it. So there is lots of other things, other sources of methane in your home where there will be very little resistance to actually buying them, especially if we have these policies put in place right now. So that way they're ready for people to use when it does come time for them to buy new appliances. And for the stove one, I know that's a lot harder for people to want to make that transition from the stove over to an electric induction cooktop. This is a conversation I've been having with my mom for the past like 2 months consistently. She's like, I love my stove. And I'm like, Mom, we all have asthma. And she's like, okay, well, we'll talk about it again. So like, I just slowly keep having the same conversation with her. And like, now she turned on the vent every single time she's cooking. And just last week she called me and she was like, oh, I was at IKEA and I saw one of those induction like stove cooktops. I think I'm going to buy a little trial one. So we're slow. It's been 2 months, right? But, we went from a hard, no, I'm never going to do that, to turning on the vent, to now she's getting a trial one. So it is just those conversations, just going there, talking to people, telling them about the health impacts, the climate impacts, and you'll slowly get through to them even with something they love like the stove. So it definitely is possible. Like Ein said, we can do hard things on an industrial level, but also just person to person having conversations.
Thank you. I'd like to have just a follow-up of the power of the city. I hear if we think about it as a carbon footprint, then I might get on board like Lexi is with her mom and get some appliance changes. But you're saying the power of the city is that they're making regulatory decisions every city council meeting for land use, for zoning, and even for incentives, that if Build Back Better had passed the House of Representatives and the Congress, there'd be money coming out for a climate change actions, and states and would be sending grants and letting cities do this. Seems like Orange County is not even taking advantage of the grants that are already out there. Other cities around California are. And so encouraging our city to research. And so I know my city does have a sustainability director. So at least there's somebody on staff that's watching this stuff to some degree, but looking for those incentives so that when I go to Home Depot to replace my water heater, which will happen every few years, I could see that there's an alternative that I can afford, and that then I can be a good example, and my city would be encouraging that in all the different ways they can.
Yes. And I would say that rebates are sort of coming out now. I know Edison is submitted to the CPUC a rebate program that should be, coming out in the next, months to, and be distributed for the next several years. We'll see more of that in the future. But then also I was going to add that, in terms of your city council meeting and your city council in general, that we know that political leaders, they do not lead, they follow. They need to see the community out there with a banner. They need to hear people asking for things before they are going to go take, risk their neck on something that they're not sure that, has the the voice of the community behind it. So they really need you to show up and ask for these things, and you never get what you don't ask for, right? So it's just a rule for living. You never get what you don't ask for. So yeah, you just got to ask for it, and then ask again, and then ask again. And if you want to join the Orange County Climate Coalition, we can put you together with, other folks who maybe sign up, and then you could be a team for your city, and you could go ask and ask and ask with this, group together, and that can be very effective. And we have seen that work also, because it's dispiriting to do it by yourself, but with a group of people, then it's kind of more fun and you get further.
I've heard about heat pumps, that in Europe, they're really pushing heat pumps so they pull heat or cooling right out of the ground, and with electricity make it much better than fossil fuels. So it seemed like there was somebody that was going to send hundreds of thousands, or 30,000 Americans over there to help install them, learn the technology, and bring it back here. But hopefully we'll have more people here that are trained how to install heat pumps, so that we will have that piece of the puzzle also.
That is something that actually Europe is much further ahead than the US in terms of heat pump adoption already, and from what I have read. But you're right that it is just sort of getting going here in the US. But I've gotten a couple quotes. It's time for me to replace my furnace and my AC unit. They're both going to die, and I want to switch them out before the summer. So I've been going through this process, and so it is doable, and there are HVAC companies that will do it for you today. So for whatever that's worth. I also see a question in the chat about how is electric induction different from just electric? The difference is that it's awesome, and plain electric is not. You have that coil burner that we've all seen that just gets real hot, but electric induction conducts the heat through magical magnets. It's not literally magical, but it just seems magical. And so it conducts the heat directly into the pan. And so only the pan gets hot, and the space around the pan does not get hot. You can actually put a towel down between the induction burner and the pot, and the food will still cook. And all it will do is keep your stove clean. It's amazing. And you can boil water in no minutes. It's actually scary how fast those things work, and the control that you have is really amazing. So I think I know 2 out of 3 Michelin kitchens uses an induction stove, just because it does provide much greater control than a gas, and I can't recommend it highly enough.
Also, I did want to just say, because we're talking about it a bit in the chat, if you're thinking about and feeling empowered to go to your city council meeting, please do. If you're looking for some of the skills, as far as just being able to actually read your city council's agenda, know how to give public comment. What does that process even look like? How do I give a good public comment? How do I find people in my city who also want to go with me to these meetings? We again invite you all to please come to our OC Climate Coalition meeting, which is happening. It's the last Sunday of every month at 6 p.m. And then if you sign up on our link tree, which I sent the link earlier, but I can go ahead and send it again, or just send us your emails, we will get you all signed up, so that way we can send you over that information.
I'm curious what cities everybody lives in. Do most of you folks live in Newport, since the Newport Bay Conservancy? Are you Costa Mesa group? Craig is looking for some friends to work with him on Costa Mesa, so maybe we can team you all up right now. Maybe you could put your city in the chat if you are comfortable. Or if you're not, then you can just message us after. Oh, Long Beach, Huntington, Long Beach, interesting. Newport. Oh, Rochester. You know what? New York's doing some really exciting things on building electrification. Ashley, you're in a good place. Garden Grove. Okay, look at that. We have Team Newport. Alex and Sharon, you're on a team together. Congratulations. Joe Carroll will be on there with you too. Susan, okay. Literally, you guys, I've seen a group of 3 people impact policy at the city level. So you have what it takes because you have superpowers in your city, because you know people and you know things that I will never know. And I've been to council, like meetings with council members where they just want to go around the table and see like, okay, who lives in Irvine? I happen to live in Irvine. Do you live in Irvine? Do you live in Irvine? Do you live in Irvine? It's like, if you don't live in the city, your voice is meaningless and they want to kick you out. But because you live in the city, all of a sudden you are like, oh, this like mythical creature, like an actual constituent. And so, yeah, so we should take advantage of that. And because people don't show up to these meetings, like even Irvine City Council meetings where there are big votes on the table. I mean, sometimes we have had the, you know, experience of being able to get hundreds or like 100 people in person. That was before COVID. But since then, you know, like you can show up, and even for a big council vote, you can have like 10 people in the chamber. Some people call in, but that's something else that we do. If you go to that link tree that Lexi shared, we also send out calls to action when big votes are coming up. And we'll let you know so that you can at least, you know, make your voice heard on these kinds of decisions. So yes, we can send the slides. We'll share the deck with Hillary, and she can share them, or we can put them in the chat, I guess. There's no reason we can't put the deck in the chat.
Yeah, I'll also send a follow-up email, and I'll include all of these links. So the link to the link tree that Lexi has shared, both Ayn and Lexi's contact info, so everyone can get that information. Any other questions? I feel so inspired by this. So thank you. I'm also just really amazed by the stoves. Craig would like to say something else.
Yeah, thank you, Ayn, for explaining the physics. You mentioned how Mother Nature is going to win, and we're fighting with physics as we pollute our planet. I was amazed at the power of a heat pump, but I don't quite understand it. Do one of you know how to explain that, just even in 3 sentences? That I think it somehow goes into the maybe down 12 feet in the earth to pull heat or cooling out of the earth?
I could try. So yes, my understanding is it's like a refrigerator that runs in reverse. I've heard it described as, but yeah, it sources, there are ground source and air source heat pumps. A ground source heat pump accesses the temperatures in the ground, which is consistent and is, you know, like cooler certainly than the ambient air. And so yeah, it uses a heat pump uses a fraction of what certainly what an air conditioning unit uses. I want to say it's like, Lexi, do you remember off the top of your head? I can't remember, but they're much more efficient. And
yeah, I think with all the numbers ran for energy usage, it's like, I want to say like a fifth or a tenth of the energy. It's way less.
Ashley is saying in the chat that in New York, where she is, that the high schools use heat pumps and they work great. So yes, they are used all over, you know, in northern regions and in southern regions. Actually, California's climate is ideal for heat pumps because it's sort of moderate. Yeah, so if you can use them in New York, you can definitely use them in California. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better explanation of exactly how it works, but that's my best effort.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us and for inspiring us all to get in there and do some work. We're getting lots of thank yous in the chat. Thank you and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.